New Orleans has always had a way of hiding its monsters behind beauty, behind the wrought iron balconies, behind the candlelight and music drifting through the French Quarter, behind the masquerade. But on Royal Street, in a mansion filled with wealth, perfume, and polished silver, something horrifying was rotting behind locked doors. The neighbors heard screams. The servants looked terrified. And still, the city's elite continued attending lavish parties hosted by one of the most respected women in Louisiana society. Her name was Delphine LaLaurie, and to the public, Madame LaLaurie was elegance personified, charming, wealthy, sophisticated. But inside the upper rooms of her mansion, enslaved people were allegedly being subjected to cruelty so grotesque that even hardened witnesses would later struggle to describe what they saw. And for years, no one stopped her. Until one night in 1834, when smoke began pouring from the LaLaurie mansion. A fire, a crowd gathering outside, and hidden behind a locked attic door. A discovery so disturbing it would turn Madame LaLaurie into one of the most infamous figures in American history. Some say the house is still haunted. Others say the real horror isn't the ghost stories at all. It's the fact that a woman accused of unimaginable brutality was protected by wealth, status, and power for far too long. This is the story of Madame Delphine LaLaurie. And trust me, the deeper you go into this case, the darker it gets. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this is When Killers Get Caught, a podcast where I examine the people, the psychology, and the moments that lead to the most extreme acts of violence, and what happens when the darkness finally meets the light. If you've been listening for a long time, you might remember that Delphine LaLaurie was actually the subject of one of my earliest episodes. But this weekend, after learning that a new season connected to American Horror Story Coven is expected in September of 2026, I found myself rewatching the season that introduced a supernatural version of Madame LaLaurie to an entirely new audience. And while I was watching, I started wondering, how much of the real story did we actually know? Were there details that I missed in 2021? New sources, new interpretations, more context surrounding the woman they called the Beast of Royal Street? What I found was a story darker, more complicated, and more disturbing than I remembered. So, today we revisit Madame LaLaurie, separating legend from documented history, exploring the myths that have grown around her name, and diving deeper into the horrifying legacy she left behind in New Orleans. Before the horror stories and the legends, before the ghost tours and the television dramatizations, Delphine LaLaurie was New Orleans royalty. But she wasn't born Madame LaLaurie. Her full name was Marie Delphine McCarty, and she entered the world March 19th, 1787, into one of the most powerful Creole families in Louisiana. The McCartys weren't just wealthy. They were politically connected, socially untouchable, and deeply embedded in an elite power structure of colonial New Orleans. Delphine's family lineage stretched back to the French colonial era, when her great-grandfather emigrated from Ireland around 1730 and established the family among Louisiana's upper class. By the time Delphine was born, the McCartys had become part of the aristocracy of the city, the kind of family whose name alone opened doors. Her father, Louis Barthélemy de McCarty, was a prominent landowner and military officer. Her relatives held positions of enormous influence throughout Louisiana and Spanish-controlled territories. One uncle served as governor over Spanish provinces in Louisiana and Florida. A cousin would later become mayor of New Orleans. Wealth, status, and political protection surrounded Delphine from the moment she took her first breath. And that's important to remember, because when people picture serial killers or sadists, they imagine outsiders, isolated people, social failures. But Delphine was the opposite. She was cultivated, educated, wealthy, and she knew how to move through elite society with grace and charm. She understood appearance better than most people probably ever will. And in New Orleans' high society, appearance was everything. But beneath the silk gowns and polished manners and glittering dinner parties was a world that was just built on unimaginable violence. Slavery was deeply woven into everyday life in Louisiana during Delphine's childhood. and she came of age during one of the most volatile periods in the history of the Atlantic slave trade. When Delphine was just 4 years old, the Haitian Revolution erupted in the French colony of Saint Domingue, now known as Haiti. Enslaved Africans organized a massive uprising against French colonists in what became the most successful slave revolt in history. And the effects of that revolution sent shockwaves through the American South and the Caribbean. White slave owning families lived in fear that the violence would spread. Rumors of uprisings circulated constantly. And in Louisiana, anxieties intensified after Delphine's own uncle was reportedly killed by enslaved people. That fear fueled increasingly brutal crackdowns and harsher punishments throughout the region. Slave revolts like the Mina Conspiracy, the Point Coup Conspiracy, and the German Coast Uprising terrified plantation owners and reinforced a culture of paranoia and retaliatory violence among the ruling class. So while I don't say this to excuse what Delphine would later become, I think it's important as context because she was raised in an environment where racial violence was normal, where enslaved people were viewed as property and cruelty was justified as simply maintaining order. Violence wasn't hidden from her world, it was embedded within it. And as she grew older, she learned how to wear her refinement like armor. By the 1830s, after multiple marriages and the death of previous husbands, Delphine had become Madame LaLaurie, a wealthy socialite married to physician Leonard Louis Nicholas LaLaurie. And together they lived at 1140 Royal Street in the French Quarter, in what was considered one of the grandest homes in the city. The LaLaurie mansion was synonymous with luxury. Guests described elaborate parties lit by candlelight and overflowing with wine, music, and conversation. Politicians, businessmen, military officers, and members of high Creole society moved through the ballroom beneath crystal chandeliers, while servants attended silently in the background. Madame LaLaurie cultivated the image of the perfect hostess, elegant, sophisticated, charitable, impeccably mannered. And to many people in New Orleans, she represented refinement itself. And that image mattered because rumors were already circulating. People whispered about how harshly she treated her enslaved workers. There were stories about servants who appeared terrified in her presence, accounts of people disappearing into the mansion never to leave, neighbors claiming that they heard screams. At one point, according to several historical accounts, Delphine was investigated after a young enslaved girl either fell or jumped from the roof while attempting to escape punishment from the madam herself. Even then, though, consequences were minimal because wealth protects people, status protects people, charm protects people, especially in a society where suffering of enslaved people was ignored entirely. And that's what makes this story so disturbing. The horror didn't exist in isolation, it was side by side with luxury. While these elite guests laughed and danced in a ballroom downstairs, there were horrible things happening in the upper levels of the house, hidden behind locked doors, away from polite society, where the carefully crafted mask of Madame LaLaurie began to crack. The ballroom glittered with wealth, while the attic sat in silence. Now, for most of her life, Delphine LaLaurie seemed to move through tragedy the way other people move through the weather. Husbands died, political power shifted, empires changed hands. And somehow, every single time, she emerged wealthier, more connected, and more socially untouchable than before. And by the time the infamous events at Royal Street unfolded, she'd already spent decades learning how power worked in New Orleans society, and more importantly, how she could wield it. Her first marriage happened astonishingly young, even by the standards of the late 1700s. At only 13 years old, Delphine was married to Don Ramon de Lopez y Angulo, a high-ranking Spanish royal officer. At the time, Louisiana was still under Spanish control following the 7 Years' War, and marriages among elite Creole families were often political and personal. Delphine wasn't simply marrying a man, she was strengthening her family's bond to the ruling colonial structure. And for a teenage girl raised among aristocrats, this would have been less about romance and just duty, status, and survival within elite society. But that marriage didn't last very long. Just a few years later, while traveling to Madrid with Delphine pregnant beside him, Don Ramon suddenly died in Havana under circumstances that are still unclear in historical records. Some historians believe that illness was the likely cause, while others have noted how suspiciously little documentation seems to exist surrounding the death of an officer. What matters, though, is what happened afterward. Delphine returned to New Orleans, still very young, now a widow with more money, social standing, and growing independence, in a world where most women depended entirely on men for legal and financial power. Widowhood could sometimes create a strange kind of freedom, especially for a wealthy woman. Delphine had learned an important lesson early in life. She could survive loss and still rise socially afterward. And she did. In 1808, she married again, this time to Jean Blanc, a prominent banker, merchant, lawyer, and politician in New Orleans. If her first marriage connected her to Spanish colonial authority, the second marriage rooted her directly into the financial and legal elite of the city. Jean Blanc was deeply embedded in the civic structure of New Orleans during a period when the city itself was rapidly transforming after the Louisiana Purchase. Wealthy Creole families were navigating this new American political system while trying to preserve their old influence, and families like the Blocks and McCartys sat right at the center of this transition. This marriage elevated Delphine to a new level. The couple would have 4 children together, and by all outward appearances, Delphine continued to thrive socially. She was known for her elegance, refinement, and impeccable presentation. But behind that polished image, historians note increasing accounts of harsh treatment toward enslaved people who were connected to her household. Nothing had reached the monstrous allegations that would define her legacy, but there were signs of entitlement and perhaps a confidence in her own immunity that seemed to just be growing. Then, death reshaped her life again. Jean Blanc died in 1816, leaving Delphine widowed for a second time. She wasn't even 30 years old yet. Now she possessed significant wealth, property, social connections, and she had 5 children, all while operating in a society that viewed her as one of the city's grand dames, rather than just simply someone's wife. And that distinction matters psychologically. By this point, Delphine had spent years watching powerful men orbit around her, while she herself continued accumulating influence regardless of whether these people lived or died. She had survived colonial upheaval, widowhood, and changing governments. And each marriage expanded her access to money and status. Each loss reinforced her position rather than diminishing it. Then came her third and final marriage. In 1825, Delphine married Leonard Louis Nicholas LaLaurie, a physician who was significantly younger than she was. And unlike her previous husbands, powerful political military men, Leonard LaLaurie was, at least by appearance historically, to have occupied a quieter and much more passive role within his marriage. That imbalance may have changed the entire dynamic of the household. Some historians and writers who have studied this case suggest that Delphine increasingly exerted total control over both her home and the people inside it during this period. By the late 1820s and 30s, she was no longer simply participating in elite society. She actively commanded her own domestic empire. In 1831 or 32, the couple moved into the mansion at 1140 Royal Street, the massive property that would later become infamous throughout American history. The home symbolized everything Delphine had spent decades building: wealth, prestige, visibility, and control. But cracks in the marriage soon became visible. Records show that Delphine petitioned the courts for a legal separation from Leonard, citing cruel treatment and irreconcilable differences. Her children reportedly supported aspects of these claims. However, the separation never really fully removed him from the household, and Dr. LaLaurie was still present at the mansion during the fire in 1834. Historians have long debated what exactly happened behind closed doors during those final years. Some believe that the marriage was deeply toxic and emotionally volatile. Others speculated that Leonard either ignored or enabled Delphine's increasingly disturbing behavior within the household. There are also theories that the instability of the marriage may have intensified Delphine's need for dominance and control in other places, particularly over the enslaved people under her authority. What is undeniable, though, is that by the 1830s, Delphine LaLaurie had become extraordinarily powerful. She was wealthy beyond the imagination of most people in New Orleans. She belonged to one of the city's most influential families, and she had survived three radically different political eras. And she'd spent decades learning a dangerous lesson over and over again. No matter what happened around her, society would protect her. Now, long before that fire at Royal Street exposed the horrors hidden inside the LaLaurie mansion, people in New Orleans had already suspected something was very wrong. And that's one of the worst parts of this story. The fire didn't create the rumors surrounding Delphine LaLaurie, it only confirmed them. By the early 1830s, there were whispers about Madame LaLaurie, and they were spreading through the elite society. The guests who attended her lavish dinners spoke quietly about the strange atmosphere surrounding the mansion. Neighbors noticed enslaved workers who appeared exhausted, frightened, or physically deteriorated. Servants seemed to vanish suddenly and without explanation. New faces appeared constantly, only to disappear within weeks or months. Even in a slaveholding society where cruelty was normalized, people noticed something about the LaLaurie household was different. A local account later described the enslaved people in her home as single, singularly haggard and wretched. That wording stands out because Delphine was extraordinarily wealthy. Her household staff should have reflected that wealth. In elite New Orleans homes, enslaved workers were often dressed in expensive garments to showcase the status of the family they served. Appearances mattered in Creole high society, but the people inside the LaLaurie household looked malnourished, exhausted, and terrified. And then there was the turnover. Enslaved people seemed to disappear from the mansion at an alarming rate. Of course, because enslaved individuals were treated as property rather than citizens, records were inconsistent and incomplete. But funeral records between 1830 and 1834 reportedly documented at least 12 deaths of enslaved people connected to the LaLaurie household. And historians believe the true number is probably significantly higher. The problem is that historical record becomes murky here. Death certificates for enslaved people were often vague or downright non existent, and causes of death were rarely investigated with any seriousness unless there was some sort of a property dispute. So we don't know exactly how these individuals died. But the neighbors noticed. And eventually the rumors became impossible for local authorities to completely ignore. Ironically, publicly, Delphine would present herself as compassionate towards Black residents and other enslaved people. Some historical accounts even suggest she made performative displays of kindness in public settings. She understood reputation management very well. In fact, there were several historians that documented how she occasionally freed enslaved people or would act charitably specifically to counter the growing gossip surrounding her home. Because at this point, the whispers had become dangerous. And then the incident that changed everything. In 1833, a 12-year-old enslaved girl named Layla, sometimes identified as Leah, died while attempting to flee from Delphine LaLaurie herself. According to the most commonly repeated version of events, the young girl had accidentally hit a snag while brushing Delphine's hair, and in response, Delphine grabbed a whip and began chasing the child through the mansion. Terrified, Layla fled upward, climbing higher until she reached the roof of the Royal Street property. And then she fell. Some accounts say she jumped in desperation. Others suggest she slipped while trying to escape. Either way, though, the child plunged to her death from the roof of the mansion. And what happened next is perhaps even darker. According to later reports, Delphine allegedly attempted to hide the body. Authorities eventually discovered the young girl's remains buried on the property. Some version of the story specifically placed the body in or near a well or a courtyard. Now, it's important to acknowledge that historians debate certain details surrounding this incident, and 19th century reporting was often very sensationalized, and over time, the LaLaurie story has become tangled with folklore and exaggeration. But regardless of which exact details are accurate, contemporary accounts agree on one single point. The death of this child triggered an official investigation into Delphine LaLaurie's treatment of enslaved people. And for just a brief moment, it looked like the system might actually hold this woman accountable. Local officials inspected her property after allegations of abuse surfaced. New Orleans technically did have laws limiting what was considered excessive cruelty toward enslaved people, not because the system viewed them as fully human, but because the city feared public disorder, property destruction, and reputational embarrassment. The laws were not designed to protect enslaved people in any meaningful or moral sense. They existed to regulate slaveholders, preserve social order, and prevent abuse so extreme it disturbed the broader society. And even within that horrifying framework, Delphine managed to raise alarms. Authorities ultimately found her guilty of illegal cruelty and ordered that 9 enslaved people be removed from her household. She was fined and legally required to sell them. On paper, this looked like punishment, but in reality, it was simply theater. Almost immediately, members of her family quietly purchased the enslaved individuals at auction and returned them directly back to her home. The entire legal action became little more than a loophole for the wealthy. And that moment says everything about the world Delphine operated inside of. People knew, officials suspected, neighbors whispered, the courts intervened, and absolutely nothing changed. If anything, the failed investigation may have reinforced Delphine's belief that she was untouchable. I mean, there were already stories circulating among neighbors. Discussions about an elderly cook who was kept chained in the kitchen stove inside of the mansion. Other people claimed that Delphine became enraged if anyone would attempt to show kindness toward her enslaved workers. One story alleged that she even physically punished her own daughter for trying to secretly feed or comfort people in her household. At the time, many residents dismissed these stories as just exaggerated gossip. But after the fire in 1834, people looked back on all of these rumors differently because the terrifying reality was that the city had already been warned about what Delphine was. April 10th, 1834 began like any other day in the French Quarter until it was different. Inside the mansion at 1140 Royal Street, a fire erupted in the kitchen. At first, it looked like a simple domestic accident. Smoke poured from the lower rooms. Flames began to climb the structure. Panic spread through the household. But what happened next would turn a routine fire response into one of the most infamous revelations in New Orleans history. Inside the kitchen, responders discovered an elderly woman around 70 years old, the household cook, and she was chained to the stove. Still alive. She made a statement that echoed through historical accounts ever since. According to the contemporary reports, the woman claims she set the fire herself, not out of carelessness, but intentionally. Her alleged words were simple and devastating. She wanted to end it all. And more importantly, she believed she had no other way out. She reportedly told those who found her that she had been sent to the upper rooms of the house before, and that enslaved people were taken there, often never came back. That single detail changed everything because it reframed the fire not as an isolated disaster, but as an act of desperation from someone trapped inside a system that she couldn't escape. As the fire spread, police, firefighters, and neighbors all converged on the scene. And this is where the official report begins to overlap with eyewitness accounts from the streets of New Orleans. According to reporting from the time, including accounts published in the New Orleans Bee, bystanders didn't wait for formal permission to act. As the flames grew and uncertainty spread, they forced their way into parts of the mansion themselves, attempting to verify whether there were enslaved workers trapped inside. But what they found deepened their urgency. Inside the lower floors, they encountered locked doors and resistance from the household. At the center of it all was Delphine LaLaurie herself, reportedly still inside the home with her husband, attempting to protect her personal belongings even as the fire spread. In some accounts, she prioritized her furniture, valuables, and possessions over evacuation. That detail, whether fully accurate or exaggerated, becomes part of the legend that formed around her. A woman more concerned with property than human life. But the most consequential moment came when neighbors demanded access to the upper floors. Delphine refused. And that refusal became a breaking point. The crowd broke the doors down. Whatever they discovered in the upper levels of this mansion permanently stained Royal Street. They moved through the house and reached locked attic space. an area that had reportedly been sealed off and inaccessible for an extended period of time. When they finally forced entry, they were met with a stench that witnesses described as overwhelming. Not just smoke from the fire, but something older, something stagnant, something like death that had been trapped inside walls. This is the moment where documented accounts become especially harrowing. Inside the attic, responders and neighbors found human beings in conditions of extreme deprivation and abuse. Several enslaved people were discovered alive, but barely. Some were restrained with iron collars affixed in ways that severely limited or entirely prevented movement. Others were found in cages or chained positions that forced prolonged, unnatural posture. Witnesses described bodies that had been confined for so long that movement itself appeared impossible. And among the survivors, conditions varied, but all accounts agreed on one point. They were severely malnourished, physically degraded, and in a state of profound suffering. And then there were those that were not fully conscious. Some individuals were reportedly found in states of extreme trauma, described in historical accounts as catatonic or unresponsive, as though they had endured prolonged physical and psychological abuse that had broken their capacity to react. The injuries described by witnesses are difficult to read and even more difficult to verify in full detail due to the limitations of 19th century reporting. But multiple accounts converge on the presence of severe physical trauma, mutilation, untreated open wounds, and injuries consistent with prolonged abuse and restraint. One of the most frequently cited eyewitness accounts comes from a local judge who entered the space during the aftermath. He described seeing a woman with missing limbs and extensive scarring across her body. Another account described an elderly woman with a severe head injury that left her unable to walk or properly respond. There were also descriptions, repeated across multiple sources, extreme restraint devices, including collars and bindings designed not just to hold people in place, but to immobilize them for long periods of time. Witnesses used words like flayed, brutally whipped, to describe the conditions of backs and torsos, though it's noted that in 19th century reporting, they often blurred the line between clinical description and moral outrage. Still, even accounting for exaggeration, the consistent core of every account is difficult to ignore. This attic was not a storage place. It contained Madame LaLaurie's horrors. This place where people had been held, restrained, and allegedly subjected to sustained cruelty. And what makes this moment even more chilling is the timing. This wasn't the first time people suspected something was wrong inside of that house. It was simply the first time anyone had been able to force the doors open. And as the fire burned through the structure and neighbors pulled survivors into the street, the illusion surrounding the LaLaurie's carefully constructed world collapsed in real time. Delphine, the elegant hostess, the elite socialite, the woman who entertained New Orleans' highest society. All of it now existed beside what had been found in her attic. And by the time the smoke cleared, the city would no longer guess about what was happening inside 1140 Royal Street. They had to decide what to do with the truth. What happened after that fire on Royal Street wasn't an investigation. It was an eruption, because once the truth of what was found in that attic spread through the city, they didn't respond with restraint. Locals responded with rage, and that rage had a target: Delphine LaLaurie and everything she had built. In the immediate chaos of April 10th, 1834, there was still confusion about who was responsible and what exactly had been uncovered, and whether anyone would be held accountable in any sort of meaningful way. Outside the burning mansion, tension between authority and public outrage was visible in real time. At one point, a judge confronted Delphine's husband, Leonard, demanding answers about what happened inside of his home. And according to later retellings, the judge's tone was direct, even incredulous, essentially asking what kind of situation could possibly justify what he had just witnessed. And Leonard LaLaurie responded. This is preserved in accounts of the incidents. It was arrogant. He dismissed the inquiry and replied, "Some people had better stay at home rather than come to others' houses and dictate laws and meddle in other people's business." A remarkable statement in that moment, not just because it was defiant, because it revealed something deeper about the world the LaLauries believed they lived in. Even as a crowd was gathering outside of a burning mansion where enslaved people were being pulled out in horrific condition, there was still a belief that his privacy outranked public accountability. But that belief would not survive the night. Once the word spread beyond the immediate scene and neighbors started repeating what people saw in the attic, the response escalated rapidly. It honestly moved through the French Quarter like a shockwave, and a crowd returned, bigger this time. Not a handful of concerned neighbors, but this was a full scale mob. This was not a quiet inspection or cautious observation. This was pure destruction. They stormed what remained of the mansion's interior, tearing apart rooms, breaking the ridiculously expensive furniture, ripping through walls, dismantling anything that could be destroyed. This home that once symbolized wealth and refinement and elite status was barely more than rubble and exposed foundation. By the time the authorities were able to gain control of the scene, there wasn't much left to preserve. The structure had been gutted, not just by fire, but by collective anger. And in the aftermath, the human cost continued. Some of those surviving enslaved individuals discovered in the attic were in such poor condition, they didn't survive in the hospital. Historical accounts suggest that at least 2 people died within weeks of the incident due to the severity of their injuries and prolonged mistreatment. Others that were physically stable enough to be moved got taken into local custody in jails, which reflects the deeply dehumanizing legal reality of the time. Rather than being treated as a victim in a modern crime scene, they were processed within a system that still classified them as property and legal liability. But something else happened in the days that followed that reveal how quickly public attention can overwhelm official containment. Authorities reportedly allowed members of the public to view the surviving victims in order to confirm the extent of their suffering. And people showed up by the thousands. Estimates suggest over 4,000 people viewed these enslaved individuals held in custody, turning their suffering into a public spectacle. Whether it was framed as curiosity, moral validation, or just proof of injustice, the effect was the same. This violence that had been hidden was now exposed for the whole city to see. And while New Orleans processed the horror inside the mansion, the LaLaurie family was disappearing. In the chaos immediately following the fire and riot, Delphine and her family fled the city. Accounts suggest she escaped by carriage under cover of confusion, moving first toward waterfront before leaving New Orleans entirely. From there, she's believed to travel to Mandeville, across Lake Pontchartrain, temporarily removing herself from the direct reach of outrage. But she didn't stay there. She eventually left Louisiana altogether and relocated to Paris, where she would spend the remainder of her life removed from the city she loved and once dominated. In France, she lived under anonymity compared to the infamy she carried in New Orleans. She died in 1849, her later life largely obscured by distance, time, and limited documentation. But her death didn't really disclose the full story. Decades later, a new layer of mystery emerged. In 1941, a copper plate was reportedly discovered in New Orleans bearing an inscription suggesting that remains associated with Delphine had been secretly returned to the city. The authenticity and meaning of this artifact have been widely debated by historians. Some people treat it as a symbolic folklore rather than verifiable evidence. Still, the idea has persisted that even after fleeing across an ocean, even after dying in relative obscurity, even after the mansion was reduced to rubble, something of Delphine LaLaurie's presence may have been brought back to the place she once terrorized. Whether literal or symbolic, the story of the copper plates reflects something larger about her legacy. Because in New Orleans, Delphine LaLaurie was never just a historical figure. She became a permanent scar in the city's memory, one that refuses to fully disappear, no matter how many versions of the story are told. When you strip away the fire, the legend, the ghost stories, and the modern retellings, what remains at the center of the case of Delphine LaLaurie is something far more uncomfortable than the myths suggest, a system that allowed her to operate in plain sight for years. And that raises a question that's still valid today. Why did it take so long for anyone to intervene? The answer is not complicated, but it is unsettling. She was protected, not just by her own charm or intelligence, but by the structure of the society she lived in. She was born into the most powerful Creole family in New Orleans, married into wealth, law, medicine, political influence. Every layer of her life reinforced the same truth. You exist within a network of privilege that insulates you from consequences. And that's what many modern psychological interpretations focus on when examining her case. what some historians and criminologists refer to as the untouchable system. It's not a clinical diagnosis, but a concept that describes what happens when wealth, status, and social capital create a psychological environment where accountability is optional. In Delphine's world, law enforcement didn't operate independently of an elite society. Judges, politicians, and property owners moved within the same social circles. And enslaved people, the ones who suffered the most in Delphine's household, they had no legal identity that could reliably trigger a meaningful protection. So even when the rumors surfaced, when the investigations were launched, even when the neighbors reported the concerning behavior, the system defaulted toward inaction or minimal punishment. And this is the part that extends far beyond the 19th century New Orleans, because those same structural dynamics still exist today in different forms. Wealth shielding people from scrutiny, reputation, softening accountability, systems that treat victims as more credible than others based on status rather than evidence. Delphine didn't operate outside this system, she exploited it. And that's what makes it so important to study, even beyond the brutality. Over time, something else would happen to Delphine's story. It evolved into myth. The case of Delphine LaLaurie has been heavily Hollywoodized, most notably through dramatizations like American Horror Story Coven, which transformed her into a supernatural figure surrounded by curses, immortality, and fantasy horror. The real story doesn't really need embellishment, though. It's disturbing. In fact, many historians argue that the truth is more unsettling because it's grounded in reality. Documented social privilege, legal loopholes, and systemic disregard for enslaved lives. No supernatural explanation is required when ordinary power is enough to explain the outcome. And after the fire, after the riot, the exposure of what was inside the mansion, Delphine's life didn't end in justice. It was just escape. She left the city that had once elevated her. An interesting and rather consistent detail across multiple accounts is this one. Delphine never stopped thinking about New Orleans. Despite warnings from her own family who believed she would likely be killed if she ever returned, she is said to have expressed a strong desire to go back home. Whether through attachment, identity, or unfinished obsession with the life she built there, she longed for the city that rejected her, but she never returned. 1849, she died in France, far from Royal Street, far from the mansion and far from the city that would spend the next century turning her name into legend. But her legacy didn't stay buried. After her departure, the Royal Street property sat in ruin for years. Locals began referring to it as the haunted house, reporting strange noises and unsettling sounds coming from the structure long after it had been partially burnt and abandoned. Whether those accounts were psychological, environmental, or simply folklore, they contributed to a mythos surrounding the location. And then in 1834, a businessman named Pierre Trastor purchased the property and began rebuilding it into what would become the modern structure. During his renovations, workers discovered human remains beneath parts of the building, a detail that has fueled decades of speculation that what the neighbors heard after the LaLauries left were not ghosts, but enslaved people beneath the floorboards starving to death. One final horrible act of torture from a woman who cared nothing of the lives of her enslaved workers. Over time, the building changed hands. It became a school, a music conservatory, apartments, a furniture store, and eventually a luxury residence. A third floor was added, and it altered the original structure. In modern times, the property once was owned by Nicolas Cage, who owned it before financial difficulties led to its sale. Today, it remains privately owned and is not open to the public in any way. And through all of these transformations from mansion to ruin to redevelopment, the story of Delphine LaLaurie has remained attached. Historians today generally classify her among the earliest documented cases of a serial offender in the United States history, though exact numbers of victims will forever be impossible to confirm. And that uncertainty is part of the legacy, too. Because the case of Delphine LaLaurie is not just about a woman. It's about what happens when power is unchecked, when victims are legally invisible, and when society decides that reputation matters more than the truth. What happened at 1140 Royal Street didn't stay in 1834. It moved through newspapers, whispers, court records, stories passed from neighbor to neighbor until fact and fear started to blur at the edges. And even now, nearly 2 centuries later, we're still trying to separate what was proven from what was preserved and what was buried under time. And when you strip away everything else, the core of this case holds a woman born into privilege, a system built to protect her, and truth refusing to stay hidden forever. The story of Delphine LaLaurie isn't just about what happened inside one house in New Orleans. It's about everything that allowed it to happen in the first place. The power that went unquestioned, the violence that was normalized, and the voices ignored until the damage could no longer be contained. Even the fire didn't create the truth, it simply revealed it. And once it was exposed, the illusion collapsed, almost instantly. The carefully constructed images of refinement, elegance, and elite society couldn't survive what people saw when the doors were finally opened. Stories like this don't stay locked in the past. They echo in the systems that reflect influence over accountability, in the moments where warning signs are dismissed because they're inconvenient, and places where suffering is easier to ignore than it is to investigate. And that's why cases like this don't fade. They persist. They evolve. They get retold, reimagined, sometimes distorted, but never fully erased. Because the truth has a way of resurfacing, even when people try to bury it. And sometimes it takes a fire, a riot, or a breaking point for it to finally come into focus. But even then, it leaves something behind. Not just ruins, not just records, but questions. Questions about who we believe, who we protect, and what we're willing to ignore when power is involved. And that's where I leave you tonight. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this has been When Killers Get Caught. And if there's one thing that this case makes impossible to forget, it's that the truth always leaves a trail. Thanks for listening.